Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Thomas. I'm 75 years of age, and I'm the son of the late Gordon W. Thomas, whose nickname was Mr. Schooner, who wrote 2 books, who chronicled the history of the Gloucester schooner and the men who sailed them, the dorymen. This original lecture was given by my father in August of 1982, and the tape ran out, so we're going to finish that tape now. I want to take you back in time now to Gloucester Harbor in the year of 1919. 14-year-old Gordon sits on the big catlog at the end of the D.B. Smith fish pier, quietly watching the schooner Elk tied up at her berth. He watches everything. Nothing escapes his youthful gaze. He looks and listens at the sights and sounds of this beautiful early spring harbor scene. The vessel lies still in the water, yet from time to time she moves gently, like some huge creature awakening from its sleep. The patched canvas sails have been lowered and secured. No one moves about her smooth deck. Her skipper and crew, home from the banks, have returned to their homes and families. Everything interests him. Tall spar poles and rigging tower above him. He listens, and the vessel seems to talk to him as she moves with a gentle breeze, stirring at her mooring lines, squeaking, groaning, chafing, and rubbing against the wharf. He looks almost transfixed, mesmerized by the wooden shape before him. The 2 great hawser eyes in the massive round bow take on the appearance of a face. The whole beauty of it is nearly magical, spiritual to the young lad. He moves now from the end of the wharf and walks quickly towards the vessel. He jumps down from the pier, grabs hold of the rigging, and starts to climb upwards, looking as he goes at the white clouds and the calling seagulls above him. This is nothing new to him. He's not afraid, for he has been alone on numerous occasions before, on several other vessels, when no one was around to yell at him and stop him. He climbs aloft, hand over hand, sure of his footing, until he reaches a point where he knows not to go any higher. He holds on tightly now and gazes out over the harbor of masts and spars all around him. His pulse has quickened from the climb and the sheer excitement of it all. God, what a marvelous sight before him. Years and years later, when he is old, he would recall this beautiful moment and remember every little detail as though it had just happened yesterday. Denied the opportunity to go to sea and become a fisherman by his legendary highline skipper father, Captain Jeff Thomas, who told his young son, "Gordon, there's too many Thomases aboard already, and you're my only son." Gordon W. Thomas spent the rest of his life working in fish markets, doing research on the great schooners of Gloucester and the brave, hardy crew known as the Gloucestermen. He conducted some 65 years of note-taking and research in the basements of the Sawyer Free Library in Gloucester, the Peabody Museum in Salem, and the Boston Public Library, literally hundreds and hundreds of hours. He also collected thousands of schooner photographs, negatives, and glass plates that would eventually become the largest, most complete, and important photograph documentation in existence of any fishing industry. Today, this important maritime photograph collection is safe and professionally housed in Gloucester's Cape Ann Museum. It was his strong conviction that it was the Gloucester fishing skippers and the crewmen, the dorymen, who indeed built the fabric of this city's great fishing industry for the past 4 centuries. many of them paying dearly for their livelihood with their lives. Simply put, these men were his heroes. In 1952, he managed, with the help of others, to publish a small book about the life histories of famous Gloucester fishing schooners that over the years has been hailed as a classic. His book, Fast and Able, sails on into the future and is now in its 5th printing. This lecture is Gordon Thomas's presentation of this book. In 1979, the city of Gloucester chose to show its gratitude to Gordon Thomas for a lifetime of chronicling the exploits of the Gloucester fishermen and their vessels from the year 1874 to the year 1930, with a tribute and testimonial at the Tavern Restaurant, attended by 350 people. It was the prolific and noted historian Joe Garland who coined the nickname Mr. Schooner that would be bestowed on G.W. Thomas that night. Plaques, scrolls, and the key to the city were given to Gordon that night, and the Canadian Consul General of Boston, in attendance, said of Gloucester's tall, spindly son, "You have been a true friend of Canada." This self-taught occupant of his own chair in maritime history had the requisite working knowledge of the design qualities, evolution, and management of the craft that made this seaport great in the world. He identified, above all, with the men who sailed them. It is all the more remarkable that with relatively little formal education, this simple but highly intelligent and single-minded man achieved an international reputation as the activist and curator, so to speak, of the schooners of Gloucester. A park at the head of the harbor he loves so much has been named in his honor. His many gifts to Gloucester include not only Fast and Able, but also the book Wharf and Fleet, considered to be by many the prettiest picture book of old Gloucester Harbor from years ago. It was 15-year-old Gordon Thomas in 1926 who named Gloucester's historic schooner Adventure, now a National Historic Landmark. He was indeed a highliner, in the tradition of the men and ships he loved so much. Those men and vessels could have no finer keeper of their logs. He often said, not in a bragging demeanor, but with a heart full of pride, "Jeff, no one has ever touched these vessels, the schooners, like I have." In August of 1982, my late father, Gordon Thomas, wanted to give a lecture, the evolution of the schooner, so to speak, from his slide collection, to the few dorymen, the old-time fishermen that were still left. There was about 9 or 10 of them left. And they would go to the Fishermen's Institute, which has now been demolished years ago. Well, he wanted to give a lecture on the schooners and the dorymen, so he gave it down at the Cape Ann Museum. And I asked him before the lecture, "Dad, how long are you going to speak?" He said, "Oh, about an hour and a half." I said, "Okay," because I wanted to tape it. So I set the machine right down in front of him. I was sitting in the front row. He was introduced. And the lecture started. The place was packed with people. And the old timers were there.
You guess you all know who I am. I wrote Fast and Able. My father, Captain Jeff Thomas, and my uncle, Billy Thomas, two of the greatest skippers out of Gloucester back in the dory days. And my father would never take me to sea, so he said there's too many Thomases on board, which a lot of the vessels in them days carried a lot of relatives, but he would never take me on a trip or anything, so I stayed ashore and I It was in my blood, so I just went into the research and writing part of it. And my aim was to, well, get as much publicity about the Gloucester fishermen of the old days around the world, as much as I could, to boost it up. And I think I have done that thing. Through Fast and Able, with 4 editions of it, and it seems to be still going strong, which I'm very happy. So I always wanted to give a little talk and show some slides to the fishermen in Gloucester, which few was left, not many. And I was going to give it down to the Institute. I mentioned it several times, but I guess not many of the boys go down the Institute now. So many stairs they have to climb, which I don't blame them. I can't climb them. And I'm just, there's not a group I'd rather show the pictures to or talk to than the Gloucester fishermen and their relatives. I hope you enjoy my show. All set? This is a picture of Gloucester Harbor in the late 70s and the early 1880s. You can see the number of vessels in the harbor, a little different than today, all anchored out there. Those are mostly mackerel seiners. And you see the style of the vessels in those days. The oak, they're very cumbersome, very hefty bows, flying jibboons on them. And these are the vessels that they carried a lot of sail. They could sail, a lot of them could sail, but they were very shallow. And they carried too much sail for their depth. And a lot of these vessels of this type were lost through the years. The design was wrong. I know take for instance 1879, we lost 29 vessels of this type for 250 men out of Gloucester. That was one of the biggest years. And you can see today why it's just nothing practically. But this type of vessel was not the right type for the fisheries. And the owners were looking for new designs. And who did they turn to? Well, it was the yacht designers that came to the rescue. And Edward Burgess was one of the first ones. Now this is another picture of one of the old type vessels. This is the Grace L. Fears, building down in Vincent Cove, on this side of the cove, where the old steamboat wharf used to be. The Bishop's Yard later on was across the cove, but this is on this side. And David Alfred Story, who was a shipbuilder at the time, he built this vessel. You can see the type for the heavy construction, and they look more like coasters than they did the fishermen that came later. Of course, this vessel had a very interesting career. This is a vessel that in 1883, Captain Elliot Griffin, that Howard Blackburn and Thomas Walsh, his dory mate, went astray. And of course, we all know the story of Howard Blackburn, of course. Everybody in Gloucester knows that story. And in 1896, she was lost on her way to Newfoundland, Captain John Aiken, on her way to Newfoundland to pick up a cargo of herring. And she sailed from Gloucester and was sighted off of St. Pierre, Miquelon, and there was a gale that night, and she'd never heard of again. And she had a crew of about seven men. Now this is another one of the type. This is one of the Georgians. See, they carried a dory on the stern, see, and they used to handline from the rails. And a great many vessels were lost in this fishery in Georges and down on Nantucket shoals, down on the shoals. And they'd be anchored there, with the lines out, hand lining from the rails, and well, if a sudden squall or a storm came up, one of them had to do break loose their anchor, and they drift down into the fleet, and sometimes carried several vessels down with them, all hands. And an awful lot of vessels are lost in that fishery, this type of vessel. This is the Otis T. Lord, built in the 1870s, and run down in 1899 off of Cape Sable. No loss of life. Now this is one of the new changes in the fleet. This wasn't a fisherman. This is the United States Fish Commission schooner, the Grampus. She was in and out of Gloucester practically all of her life. And she was designed by Captain John Collins of the Fish Commission with the help of D.J. Lawler, the pilot boat designer and yacht designer in Boston. And a great many changes took place. You can see for yourself how pretty she is. She got the plumb stem, straight stem, and the long pole bowsprit, and the mast, instead of the mast of equal length, you got the sharp foremast, and much finer lines than what came before her. She was built in Noank, Connecticut in 1886, and she was around for a long, long while. She used to make calls at all the fish hatcheries along the coast, and even she went down as far as Newfoundland and the maritime provinces, and very familiar in Gloucester Harbor. And there's the Harry L. Belden. She was designed by D.J. Lawler. She looks like the pilot boat that he designed, the Boston pilot boats, with the plumb stem. And she was built with a flying jibboom, but here she's shown a pole bowsprit, which was put in later. The flying jibbooms were done away with because they were cumbersome things and awkward, and the pole bowsprit came along, a spike bowsprit, and took the place. And she was a very rugged vessel, and of course in 1892 she became famous as the winner of the 1892 250th anniversary race. She caught the fleet looking that time because she went up against some of the fastest sailors out of Gloucester, the Nanny Bowen, Ethel B. Jacobs, Grayland, and they were all in trim for a race, but they expected light winds that day, the day of the race, and most of them took out their, lightened up on their ballast, and well, the next day, why, it was a raging gale, and she had come in the night before with barrels of mackerel on deck. They kept them right on. They didn't take nothing out of it, and she was right and trim for the gale. Well, she went out that day, and she beat the fleet. And of course, I don't think in the ordinary weather, sailing breeze, I don't think that she could beat the Ethel Jacobs or the Nanny Bowen, but she was in trim that day because they were bobbing around like corks. They broke up booms and gaffs and tore away sails, and some of them had to quit. But she kept right on her course under Captain Morris Whalen, and she won the race. And they always call that the race that blew. And it was one of the best races the fishermen ever sailed on. She was lost in 1901 off of Green Island, Nova Scotia. She ran ashore in the fog, and no loss of life. She was built in 1889, and as I say, D.J. Lawler of Boston designed her. As most all of the plumb stem vessels out of Gloucester was designed by Lawler. The last one is two of them, built in 1901, the Annie Parker and the George Parker. They were the last of the plumb stemmers. Now this is a vessel kind of in-between type. This is the Lucille of Sylvain Smith Company. named after Captain Savannah Smith's daughter. And she was built in 1890. As you can see, she's a little different. Her mast are the old type, the same length. She's got a pole bowsprit, and the trim of her hull is a little finer than the old type, but not quite like the beauties of it to come later on. She was lost in 1901, Captain Marty Welch, Sainon. She was run down by a British steamer off of Nantucket, and the crew picked up. Nobody was lost. Now there's the Queen of the Fleet at the time. This is when this vessel came to Gloucester, it was just like the Queen had come. You see the sharp lines, of course the yacht lines. She was designed by Edward Burgess and built in Essex by Moses Adams in 1889. She was built as a yacht, a heavy construction, to be changed to a fisherman later on. She was built for Commodore Malcolm Forbes at the Eastern Yacht Club, Marblehead, and Captain Charlie Hardy was the captain, Gloucester captain, the famous Sainon captain, and the Fredonia. And she was brought quite a change to the fleet. You can see one of the older vessels astern of her, and you see the long clipper bow and the long pole bowsprit, this fine hull, and the mast, and she was very fast vessel. In fact, after Commodore Forbes used her for a couple of years, she was sold to the William H. Jordan Company in Gloucester, and Captain Charlie Hardy took her out mackerel seining in the beginning, and she was lost in 1896. Captain Thad Morgan lost in a gale at sea and lost 2 of her men with her. But a great many vessels were built off of her model, and the vessels that were later to come. And she was one of the forerunners, and a handsome vessel. Now here she is in dry dock. She's over in East Boston in Simpson's dry dock there, and getting ready for a race. She had a race while she was a yacht. She's usually a yacht here, against the paddle boat Hesper, fast paddle boat, Boston paddle boat, who claimed they could beat anything afloat. But the Hesper had a race with her out in the bay, and the Fredonia beat her easily. And you can see the Hesper astern of the Fredonia. They were both getting ready for the race. It's a good picture showing the fine lines of the Fredonia and the beautiful bow, the long pole bowsprit, and she was quite a vessel. Now there's another introduction of a new rig into the fleet. That's the Richard Steele, owned by George Steele, Gloucester vessel owner, and she was a flush decker. She had the one continuous deck, where most of the vessels in the fleet had the grub beam, or the break we called it, kind of a separation in the deck at the stern section a little higher than the forward section. These flush deckers were, I understand, not too popular with the fishermen, because they claim if a wave came up over the bow, and it would sweep right along the deck, right up to the wheel. Very dangerous. And there wasn't too many of them built. But this is a Richard Steele, and she was lost about 2 years later down off of Nantucket. Got no loss of life. She's designed by Tom McManus. He was the son of a Boston sailmaker, and he later became the greatest designer of fishermen that there was. He brought many new ideas into the fleet, and you can see here, very yachty looking, very sharp clipper bow, the long full bowsprit, and you can see that the fleet was rapidly changing. Now that's a vessel that's still afloat. That's the Effie Morrissey. I think that this picture here is one of the best pictures of the Morrissey ever taken, because it was taken when she was fishing out of Gloucester. Captain William Morrissey had it built, and named after his daughter. Later, Captain Clayton Morrissey, his son, took over, and she brought in a lot of big trips while she was fishing out of Gloucester. She's a very pretty vessel, and built by James's yard in Essex in 1894. Because this vessel had 4 lives. She, after she's used in Gloucester for a few years, she was sold to Digby, Nova Scotia, and Captain Ansel Snow of Digby bought her, and she fished out of Digby quite some time. And then she was sold to Captain Bob Bartlett, the Arctic explorer and former seaman captain. And of course he used her on Arctic expeditions of the National Geographic Society and different expeditions in the Arctic for quite some years. Then Captain Bob died, and she was brought to Gloucester and hauled up for a while, and then sold, and to the Cape de Verde traffic, the trade. Because the Cape de Verde trade brought up a lot of old Gloucester vessels. They were the Portuguese from New Bedford. They came from the Cape de Verde Islands off the African coast, and a lot of them had settled in New Bedford and Providence. They came over originally in the whaling vessels, and they were part Negro, part Portuguese. And they bought up a lot of old Gloucester vessels when we were tired of them. They bought them cheap, and they never had much money. They never kept them in too much repair. They bought up a lot of old vessels, not only Gloucester schooners, but coasters and things. And well, it seemed so that as fast as they used to buy them, they used to lose them. Because as I say, they never had the money to keep them up, and sailing across the Atlantic back and forth was dangerous. They used to bring people over and bring food and clothing and stuff back to the islands. And it was quite a trade. But this one outlasted the whole of them. And the last time I saw her in Providence, she'd been renamed Ernestina. And she was in bad shape. The vessel was badly hogged. She was drooping at both ends. That's what you mean by being hogged. And she was practically worn out. But now group has got together, and with the help of the Cape de Verdean government and money from this country, I understand she's on her way over here now. They're going to bring her back to, I don't know, Providence or New Bedford and make her into a museum, I guess. And there's the brochures that are upstairs there telling all about the vessel. But she had 4 lives, tough old vessel, and she's the second oldest vessel afloat, Gloucester vessel, still afloat. The Lady G. Howard, it's in the South Street Museum in New York, a little vessel, built in 1883, and of course the Morrissey was built in 94. But she should be very interesting to take a look at. This vessel was built in 1893 with the Jameses in Essex. A great light wind sailor, the Marguerite Haskins, from the Jordan fleet, mackerel seiner. She was great in light wind, and she was around Gloucester for quite some time. A lot of notable skippers, sailing skippers, went sailing in her, and she's a pretty hard vessel to beat in light wind. She was designed by Captain Mel McLean from Rockport. Now he was a fishing skipper, a real legitimate fishing skipper that became also a designer. He designed many, many vessels in the Gloucester and Boston fleet, especially the clipper bow type. And he lived in Rockport. He's a mackerel sailing skipper. He designed his last vessel, a round bow vessel, in 1906, the Good Luck. But this vessel was named after his granddaughter, Marguerite Haskins. And she's one of the only vessels that I know of, fishing schooners around these parts, that, in my time, that had a little figurehead, had a little figurehead of a woman, a bust of a woman, painted in different colors, up under the bow. And I was always fascinated by that. I'd get down on the wharf and sit there and gaze at that. I wished I'd taken a picture of it. But
Drying their pants up on the sail on that one, did you see it? They were drying their pants up on the sail on that one, in the mast, did you see it?
No. I didn't notice it yet. Now, here's quite a crowd. That's the Indiana in 1894 on a trial trip. There were trial trips in those days, was quite the thing. And they all took out crowds of people. This one here, I guess, had about one of the biggest, around 220. And she's shown sailing out of Gloucester Harbor, but unfortunately that day there was no wind, and a light fog set in, and she got outside about 10 miles outside of the breakwater, not the breakwater, that wasn't built, of Eastern Point, and she had to return. But the crowd had a great time, so I heard. They served the fish chowder aboard, and sometimes they carried a little band with them, and sang songs, and it was quite a time. This is the Indiana. Captain Sewell Smith, great down east captain from Maine, was the first captain. And she was owned by Andrew Layton. He's the vessel owner at the time. She was designed off of a Burgess design, off the Fredonia design. And a very interesting vessel. In 1904, she was fishing off of Sable Island, and two of the dories were out, and fog set in, and one of her dories got astray, and all the men, unfortunate men, they started rowing, and they got confused. They kept rowing and rowing and rowing, and until they couldn't row no longer. Their hands were blistered, and they drifted along with the current. They just dropped in the dory finally. They drifted along with the current, and she drifted over 200 and some odd miles. And the dory was picked up within 40 miles off of St. Pierre, Miquelon, 11 days later. They had no food whatsoever, and just a little bit of water. When they were picked up, they were more dead than alive. And they were picked up by a Canadian vessel and brought into North Sydney, Nova Scotia. But they survived. And I believe that's one of the longest times astray of any of the Gloucester fishermen. It's 11 days at sea. And another interesting thing about this vessel, in 1910, she broke the round-trip record to Newfoundland for a herring cargo in 17 days. She sailed from Gloucester and back in 17 days, picked up her cargo. Captain L. Miller, great sailing skipper, took her down, and picked up his cargo, and he sent the vessel back to Gloucester under Captain Jack McEwen, the mate. And he took the steamer and steamers and trained back home. That vessel beat him 4 days. And she would have broken all records to Newfoundland, the fastest record to Newfoundland, if she hadn't run into a snowstorm off the Thatchers and hove to for 11 hours. But still, she beat Al Miller 4 days. And the great joke around town was that some of his men came up to him, or some of his friends, and said, Al, if you was in such a hurry to get home, why didn't you come to the vessel? She was finally sold to the Cape de Verde trade, and I lost track of it. It's pretty hard to pick up vessels, what the final ending was in the Cape de Verde trade, because the Portuguese didn't carry any records. Only the British and American carried good records of vessels. You could trace the final ending through both nations, but anything else, French or the West Indies or anything, they never kept no records. This is the Indiana, frozen in Gloucester. She had come in, and you can see the ice on a rigging there, on a bobstay, and during the night there, the harbor had frozen over, and vessels in those days used to ice up tremendously. And you can see halfway up the rigging, the dories used to freeze into a block, sails frozen, and I use this picture in my Wharf and Fleet book, and I said she's even got a nose frozen. You can see a bowsprit there, the tip end of it frozen in a blob. This is the Indiana. There's a real Gloucester pioneer, one of the greatest captains out of Gloucester, Saul Jacobs. And he wasn't only a captain, he's the king of the mackerel fleet, because year after year his stocks were way ahead of anybody else, usually. And the big tall man from Trillingate, Newfoundland, and a man with very little education, but he became a real pioneer. He took 2 vessels out to the Pacific coast around the Horn, and fitted them out and took one of them out, and they went into the halibut fishery out there, the sealing industry, and he was the first man to ship frozen halibut across the country. In 1900, he introduced gasoline power into the fleet. In 1902, he introduced steam power into a large vessel into the Gloucester fleet. And he was, as I say, one of a real pioneer. If there ever was one, Saul Jacobs was the man. That's the schooner Admiral Dewey, 1898. She was built for the fletched halibut industry to Greenland and Iceland. She was owned by John Chisholm Company, and Captain Hayes was the master, and she made many trips to, after fletched halibut. Fletched halibut was, the halibut was caught and salted, or split rather, and like a fillet, boned, and taken and salted, and packed down into the hole, and then brought to Gloucester, where it was smoked. And of course, smoked halibut in them days, even up into the days when I had fish markets in the 1920s and 30s in Gloucester, it was a luxury, a delicacy, and you don't never hear of it now. But there was quite a fleet that went to up off of Greenland and Iceland. It was quite far to sail, but the skippers were all great navigators, all did reckoning, that they knew where they were going, what they were doing. And this vessel was finally sold to Newfoundland and lost in St. Pierre Harbor in a storm. Now this is a launching down in Vincent Cove. Of course, that cove is all filled in now, cold storage down there, back of the North Shore Theater. And this is the launching of the Helen Miller Gould, the first vessel in the New England fleet with gasoline power. She's a big vessel. She's designed by Captain Mel McLean in Gloucester, in Rockport. Clipper-bowed vessel, and she had a shortened rig, shorter bowsprit, shorter mast, and she had a giant engine, 150 horsepower Globe engine, which they said at the time was the biggest engine in the country, made by the Globe Works in Pennsylvania. And their first engineer was a Negro, Dick Smith. He was around Gloucester as an engineer in some of the earlier vessels. And you can see quite a crowd. And of course, a lot of people used to go down and see the launching of the vessels in Vincent Cove. This was probably one of the largest crowds because the vessel had been given a lot of publicity. And Saul Jacobs was great for that, you know what I mean? He wanted to let people know what he was doing. And she was named after the daughter of Jay Gould, a big New York financier in New York. And Helen Miller Gould was a friend of Saul Jacobs. And he named the vessel after her. There she is. That's her on a trial trip. Now you see the mast is shortened, and her bowsprit is shorter, and she's a big vessel, and she's on a trial trip there. She just looks as if she's really moving, and unfortunately, while she lasted, just about a little over a year, she was a record breaker in the mackerel fishery. And one of her trips, she landed 750 barrels of salt mackerel. And that's quite a trip. And Saul was high line that year, as usual. But unfortunately, the vessel was at North Sydney, Nova Scotia, and she had put in there, and there was a leak in the gas tanks, and she caught fire, and she burned up. Total loss. And they couldn't get near her to save anything because on account of the explosion, they were feared of the leaking gas. But she didn't last very long. But she's quite a vessel. The following year, 1902, Saul had the big steamer built in Essex, the Ellis Jacobs, named after his youngest daughter. And she was a big steamer, and she did well in the mackerel fishery too. And but she didn't last long. She was lost on the Newfoundland coast, and she went down to pick up a herring cargo. And she lasted about 2 years. Now there's the biggest vessel out of Gloucester, biggest two-master. That's the Tatler in 1901. Very interesting vessel, built by Arthur D. Story in Essex in 1901. And you see the size of her. And she brought in more salt fish than any vessel. And her skipper, Captain Alden Gill, was the greatest of all salt fishermen. He went dory handline, and that's single dories with men handline from the single dory, one man. And the salt bankers carried 2 men through using trawls in the salt fishery. But she was a dory handliner, and she probably carried about, she probably carried about 26, 27 single dories. And this vessel brought in more big trips, where the usual salt fishermen would probably bring in 300,000, 350, maybe 4. There would be a big trip of salt fish. Well, this fellow here brought in, right here, this picture taken in 1909 by Ernest Blatchford. She had 480,000 aboard. And he brought in several trips right under 500,000. 1916, he landed 510,000 in one trip. As I say, he brought in more big trips of salt fish than anybody. And he had done well before he had got this vessel in the magazine Elliott, landing many big trips too. As I say, I'd consider him the biggest of all salt fishermen. Like Saul Jacobs was the king of the mackerel, he was the king of the salt fishermen. There's a Lottie Jean Merchant, one of the Jordan fleet, built by James in Tower in Essex, 1901. A pretty little vessel. And this shows her at Philadelphia. She's unloading a herring cargo. Because when the vessels came in from Newfoundland with their cargoes, sometimes they were sold at different ports. And they'd leave for Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York. And she's shown at one of the railroad wharfs there unloading the herring. And she was run down in 1918 off the Maine coast on a sailing trip. Captain Alonzo Smith lost 1 man. She was run down by a big coaster. And fortunately, only 1 man was lost. There's another evolution in the fleet. She was the first knockabout. She put a glass of water handy. See, I get dry now. I talk so long. I'm not what I used to be, I guess. This vessel was built in 1902 by Oxon and Story in Essex. And she was designed by Tom McManus to try to cut down the deaths in the fleet. They eliminated the bowsprit, and the main boom was shorter, which a lot of men lost off of the bowsprit and the main boom. And she was a handy little vessel. They say you could turn her on a dime. Very good in light winds. She was built for Cassius Hunt in Boston, and Captain William Thomas of down east, down Maine. They called him Down East Billy. There's 2 William Thomases, and this is Down East Billy, named after his daughter. No relation to my family. And just about 90 foot long. And she was finally sold to the Garden Pew in Gloucester, used as sailing. And she finally, Garden Pew sold her to Bermuda, and she's used down there for a while as a pilot boat, and she's lost down there. But she was a very handy little vessel. And as I say, it did eliminate lives, because that was a rig that was to be carried on to the end with the elimination of the bowsprit, and a great change in the fleet. Now there's Captain Alden Gill, the great salt fisherman. This is taken at the wheel of the Columbia in 1923. He was the first captain of the racing schooner Columbia. He took her dory handliner. But This man there, I've never pinned it down yet where he came from. There's so many different stories. Some say Shelburne, some say Maine claimed him, and even somebody said he came from Newfoundland. I don't know. I've never been able to find out for sure. But I know he was a great fisherman, and he was found dead aboard the schooner Thomas Garden in Shelburne Harbor. And one of Gloucester's greats. There's the Selma coming out of Gloucester Harbor. I had this picture blown up. A very interesting detail on the mastheads. She's coming out of Gloucester Harbor on a trial trip. See, she's got the American flag flying like they usually did, and the big bird G with a name on it below it. And up in the foremost head, setting the topsail there, is Wiley Rudolph, my old friend, and of course the Gloucester fisherman. He's very popular among the fishermen. He came from Kent, so I became friends with him. And he was a young lad at that time. The vessel 1904. She was a crown shield design. He was a yacht designer, and great spoon bow. He looked very yachty, his vessels did. They had a shorter foremast than the mainmast. That was a characteristic of the crown shield vessels. And Selma, Muriel, and Fame, Harmony, and all the vessels designed by Crown Shield. Felix Hogan was the captain of this vessel at the time, and I was given this plate. It was found on a warehouse down in Duncan Street. Herman Spooner took the picture. Very interesting. And I came across it, and I went home, and I identified it through the flag with the initial and the nameplate on the bow. And I didn't notice anything, you know, and I met Wiley that night, and I told him about getting the plate. He says, "The Selma?" He says, there's I think one of the best pictures ever taken of a fisherman. That Herman Spooner took that of the Ingomar. You see, it's the shadows in the water. It's a beautiful picture. The Ingomar, built in 1904, and by James and Tyron Essex for the Cunningham Thompson Company, named after a big yacht that was around at the time. Captain Wallace Parsons is captain of the vessel there. She's on a sailing trip. She was originally built, the first trip, she went to Newfoundland for a herring cargo under Captain Parsons. And this is her sailing out of the harbor on a first trip sailing. And as I say, Herman Spooner, who was a city engineer here in Gloucester at the time, and also a very fine photographer. The old Cape Ann Camera Club at that time, that was around Gloucester for quite a few years, had many fine photographers, amateur photographers. Herman Spooner, and Ernest Blatchford, Conrad Hansen worked down the bank, and that's where most of all of our photographs came from. I was fortunate to get the biggest part of the Blatchford collection. I made friends with Mr. Blatchford, a fine old man who was manager of the Gloucester Fresh Fish Company, New England Fish Company for years, and took many pictures as a hobby on the side. And well, that's the end of the Ingomar. She was taken over by Gordon Pugh when the Gordon Pugh gobbled up the Cunningham Thompson Company in 1917. And of course, you know the Gordon Pugh Company consisted of the big four, we always called it. John Pugh Company, David B. Smith Company, Reed and Ganridge and Slade Gorton Company in 1906. And then in 1917, they took over the second biggest company, the Cunningham-Thompson Company, down in Fort. So they got this vessel when they took over the company. And she's here. This is the end of her on Plum Island. Captain John Atwood got astray in the fog there and hit the beach and broke her back. She didn't last many days. And we broke up into kindlewood. No loss of life. And she was a fine vessel and a very interesting vessel. Good, tough vessel. And of course, in the 1920s, the early 1920s, around 22, 23, 24, Captain Carl Olson made halibut history in this vessel. With the halibut trips he landed and the big stocks he made, he seemed to hit the prices, the market just right. And with his big trips, and boy, he sure piled up the stocks. He's quite a halibut. And later on, I think the Catherine landed, Archie McLeod landed bigger trips of halibut, but he didn't quite come up to the stocks that Captain Carl Olson did. And Captain Ivor Carlson at the time, another Scandinavian, was another big halibut at the time, who later went into beam trawls and made big money. But Carl Olson was really there, all right. Speaking about the big four, the Gordon Pugh, my father never, because he sailed for half a dozen vessels out of the Gordon Pugh, and but he never called it the Gordon Pugh. He'd come home and say, well, I'm going to take over the Elmer Gray from the Big Four. He always called it the Big Four. And I guess a lot of people did at that time. But Gorton's today is not Gorton's of then, because a lot of local people in the company in them days, and they're gone. And now it's General Foods, I guess, owns it. I guess it's a lot different. There's another experiment in the fleet. That's 1905, McManus design. That's the first vessel with pole mast, what we call pole mast or spike mast, no topmast. You can see the height of them. They wanted to do away with topmast. And it was an experiment. You can see I always liked this vessel. Her lines, her bow, I like that bow. But she's the only one ever built with a bow like that, quite like that. And they tried her out, and it didn't work out too well. She's a Boston vessel, and named after Thomas Cromwell. He was a ship outfitter in Boston, and it didn't work out well. And in a few years, they cut the mast down about 8 feet and put topmast in it, and like the other vessels. And she was finally sold in Newfoundland and lost, taking a cargo of fish across the Atlantic. Like most of the vessels that went to Newfoundland, that's how they wound up. This is a Raymond, named after my oldest daughter, who's here in the audience today. And Captain Felix Hogan built at the Oxford and Story Yard in Essex. That yard is in South Essex. It used to be down back of the old drugstore that used to be there in the bowling alley, which is gone now. And there's a motel down there now. And the old Willard Burnham yard. And this is where the Oxford and Story, they put out a lot of vessels from 1901 to 1907. And the Raymond was a big vessel, a Boston vessel, owned by the Atlantic Maritime Company. And then Felix Hogan, of course, as I explained in my book, which I always like to tell, my daughter's named after this vessel. And usually they name vessels after people, but I named my daughters after vessels. Cynthia after my father, Cynthia. And this vessel was seized in 1908 down in North Sydney by the Canadian government, which was one of them silly rules that they had off and on through the years. I always thought they were foolish, but fishing within the 3-mile limit, because they were all Canadians. The biggest part of the crews and skippers are Canadians and American vessels, and like resting brother. But they did seize a lot of vessels, and they wouldn't release them until they were seized by Canadian cutters. And they wasn't released until the fine was paid. I think the Raymer, they paid $3,000 at that time to get the vessel back. But I never thought too much of that. They always caused a lot of trouble between the two governments too. And but finally wiped it out. And Saul Jacobs, back in his days, always had a lot of trouble with the Canadian government. And, there's a picture at sea of the Lizzie Stanley. That's Captain Josh Stanley, down east from Maine, captain. He's a big fellow. See his big mittens there on, and his men at the wheel there. It's heavy weather there. They say he's quite a guy. He's a good skipper too, Josh Stanley. Had the Lizzie Stanley for years. And she was finally sold to Newfoundland and lost down there at all hands. There's a taken at sea. That picture was taken by Captain Chester Morrissey aboard the Ornado. He took quite a few pictures, and I was given a set, and I had a slide made up. That's sea. There you can see she's icing up, but no fun. I was never there, but I know it was no fun. There's my father. It's taken at the wheel of the Cynthia in 1910. The vessel was built in 1906, and at the fish pier in Boston. You can see the derby hat there. They used to wear in them days. All the skippers wore the derbies, and he had a mustache. And a big man, he weighed 265 when he died. And they tell me when he was first married, he was thin as a rail. But I guess the sea was good to him. You can see the size of his hands. He had hands on him like two big hams. I never forget. I always used to be fascinated by them. They were like steel. They were so hard. And if I do say so myself, this man was one of the greatest sail carriers out of Gloucester, and one of the big money makers too, especially in the shacking business that days. And of course, my uncle Billy Thomas, I'd say, after looking through all the records and the research that I've done and sizing up the stocks that he piled up. Now this is back in the old days. I think my uncle Billy Thomas was the greatest haddocker ever sailed out of Gloucester, and the money he made in those days. And it was fabulous. And it was hard to get a sight for the fishermen to get a sight with Billy Thomas, and a sight with my father when he was in his prime, and also other famous skippers at the time, like Carl Olsen, when he was Hollywood. It was hard to get a sight with. Saul Jacobs, that was really something to get a sight with. And the Boston skippers like Enos Nickerson and Ernest Parsons, the great haddockers. It was pretty hard to get get a chance to go fishing with them there. And
What was the price of haddock, Dad, in those days?
oh, Lord's sake, haddock, they gave them away. 3 or 4 cents,
3 or 4
5
cents?
cents.
3 or 4 cents?
God's sake, yes. Prices today compared to today, and then they squawk today. God's sake. My father brought in over 100,000 of halibut just before he died. And she was loaded in the adventure. And he got 10 cents for it. 10 cents for his halibut. You know what that would bring today? He'd retire on one trip. But they never got nothing for what they went through.
Do you want to mention Billy Thomas's stock, Dad, when you get through?
Oh, Lord's sake, his stock. I can't think of it right off.
198,000? 198,000 stock.
Oh, yes. His stock there was fabulous. In those days, back in the 80s and 90s when Billy Thomas was in his prime, he started away. He was older than my father, and stocks in those days that he piled up. He carried a lot of Ayrshire men with him, Frenchmen from Ayrshire, where he came from, where the Thomases came from. They're good fishermen. They're all good fishermen. There's a Cynthia, 1906, outward bound. There's my father at the wheel. In winter rig, Haddocken. She's got a topmast down. And she's built down by Vincent Cole, by John Bishop. And is owned by Savannah Smith Company. All of the Savannah Smith Company vessels are ended in IA, like Savannah, Arcadia, Bohemia, Claudia, Lucania, and like the Canard Line. Now there's a Cynthia on a maiden trip. My father really almost lost her on a maiden trip. She's coming up New York Harbor to Triple-Macco. And in the fog, she hit on Roma Shoals. That's a very dangerous shoal in lower New York Harbor. A lot of vessels have struck that shoal. And it's a brand new vessel. And the crew were taken off by another vessel alongside of it, the Mattakesett. And my father had the wrecking company over in Erie Basin, Scott Wrecking Company, Merritt & Scott Wrecking Company. They sent a lighter down, a great big giant lighter, and sent divers down, hard hat divers, of course, in them days, and put straps around her, chains around her, and lifted her right up, and took her up to Erie Basin, New York, fish and all. And she was repaired there, and but she's never the same after that. She leaked, always leaked, and she wasn't fast enough for my father. That really galled him, and so she was built in 1906. 1913, he bought a quarter of the Savannah from the same company, Savannah Smith Company, and in 1915 he bought another quarter, which gave him half of the vessel. She could go, and that's where he built up his reputation in the Savannah. My father never went mackerel sailing after that. He swung over the Haddocken, and of course later on in life he turned to halibut. But the Savannah was lost in Cynthia was lost in 1914. Captain Andrew Grimes had a halibut in the wintertime, and she was icing up badly and leaking, sprung a leak and iced up tremendously, and she was sinking, and had the stress up, flags up, and the big cable steamer Minia took off the crew just in time before she sank, and that was the end of the Savannah. That was in 1914 on St. Peter's Bank. That's 1906. That's the Effie Pryor. Captain Elroy Pryor, great down east from Maine, mackerel sailing skipper, and named after his wife. She was Effie Pryor. She was a Gooding from Shelburne. I knew her very well. And Pretty vessel, very pretty sheer. She's really crooked sheer. McManus design, the long pole bowsprit. She's sailing on a maiden trip. The same boat towing, bound to the southern, and little flags up. And on the day that this picture was taken, the San Francisco earthquake was taking place on the other side of the continent. And we all heard about what a disaster that was. But the Effie Pryor was sold to Newfoundland and lost down there. And she was sold, at that time, prices were cheap. She was sold to Newfoundland for $6,500. Now you can see the size of that vessel. And to be sold at that price, which is peanuts today. $6,500 they got for a whaling company in Gloucester. Yeah, and she's a good vessel too, good shape when she was sold, but as I say, prices are cheap. But later on, during the war, the World War I, II, prices went out of sight for these vessels. That's a picture taken in 1906 of the Gloucester Harbor, looking down towards Pew's Wharf, see the Forester mast. And that's the steamboat wharf, just astern of the Cape Ann, the steamer Cape Ann showing, that used to run the Boston to Gloucester, and the tugs Nellie and Evelyn at the foot of the wharf. Up at the little office there, up the top there, in the end of the building, that was the towboat office at that time. And that wharf was wiped out in 1926, the steamboat wharf, in a disastrous fire. And that's when the harbor was pretty. Not like that today. There's the Esperanto, 1906, built by James and Todd for the Jordan Company, for mackerel seining, Captain Charlie Hardy. A great vessel. And she was finally taken over by the Garden Fuel Company. And she was a McManus design, and a good sailor. And of course, Charlie Hardy was one of the greatest sailing masters out of Gloucester. He was always given a lot of vessels to try out on their maiden trips, especially from the Jordan firm. And as I say, the vessel was taken over by Garden Fuel, and then the challenge came in 1920 from Canada, from the Halifax Herald, offering a cup to be raced for a Gloucester vessel against the Canadians. They had had a race down there and among the Canadian vessels, and the Delawana, typical Lunenburg vessel, had won the race. And, well, it was accepted by the Garden Fuel Company, but they looked around for a vessel, and there wasn't too much to pick from because the vessels all had power then, you know, they were getting the engines in them, and they only a few salt bankers left, and the Esperanto happened to be available. She was in, so she's known to be a good sailor, so she was fixed up, painted up. I remember seeing her on the ways and given her a suit of sails, patched up sails there she had, and they sent her down to Halifax. Well, we know what happened. She easily beat the Canadian vessel Delawana by some very smart sailing by Captain Marty Welch, who was chosen to sail the vessel, because Captain Marty was one of the great sailing skippers out of Gloucester and handling a vessel. And he was picked, and she beat the Delawana in 2 straight races. And before the vessel left Gloucester, they say Captain Charlie Hardy was called in, and his advice on the trim of this vessel. And I guess she's a little bit down by the head. And he told her what to do, and they lightened her up. And they say he was a master in getting a vessel in trim. So anyhow, she beat the devil on her and came back, where she was given a tremendous reception when she left Gloucester and when she returned. I saw both of them. And whistles blew, and the kids were let out of school. And of course, they showed moving pictures of it down the North Shore. The crew were invited, and they were given gold watches. Oh, quite a thing. Gloucester's pretty proud. Well, that was the beginning of the international fishermen races, and beginning of a lot of controversy, which I won't go into too much. In this show here, I'm not getting involved too much in the racing fishermen anyhow. It's more of the change in the rigs of the vessels and how they changed from the old-fashioned to the new. And the following year, disaster overtook the Esperanto. She was dory handlining and fishing in close to Sable Island, where there was always good fishing for the dory handliners and salt bankers, and she struck a wreck, the state of Virginia, a steamship wreck. The engines were still underwater off the Sable Island on the shore there. She struck, went down, started to go down. Crew were taken off by the Elsie. Captain Alvin Gill, who had the Elsie at the time, he took off the crew. They sent a couple expeditions down with the beam trawler Fabia from Chisholm's with pontoons to try to raise the vessel, because Gloucester had taken such pride in it, you know. And they raised the vessel up. They got her up out of the water, but bad weather set in, the cable snapped, and down she went and started to break up, and that was the end of it. But she was a handsome vessel. That's the end of it on Sable Island. That's the end of it. My father had a lot of brushes with the Esperanto when he was at the Sylvania carrying sail. I understood later on by crews from both vessels. And they had some great bouts between them. She could sail. I think that the races in 1920 were the only races we had that really were something. They were, because they were sailed, both the Delawana and Esperanto, in vessels, conservative fishermen. There was no cutting of sails and no vessels being built to race specially, and no wrangling, you know. It's good, legitimate sailing. But there's a little vessel, Clara Silva. She'd built in 1906. She's one of the Portuguese fleet, the shore fleet. So single dories. She's a small vessel, not a great, you know, about 80, 90 foot. And Captain Manuel Silva. And those vessels used to fish on the shore, short trips, probably 2 or 3 trips a week they'd make to the Boston market, you know, and fish on the nearby banks, the Jeffreys, Caches, and the near banks, and the single dories. And, well, she built in 1906, 1907. She happened to be fishing on Jeffreys, and a sudden squall came up. The dories are out. 10 of her dories went over, and 10 men were lost of the Portuguese fleet. And it was quite a loss of the fleet. The Clara Silva was finally sold to down south to Pensacola for snapper fishing. Was lost down there. Pretty little vessel. In 1917, speaking about losing men in squalls, 2 big Provincetown Portuguese vessels, the Natalie Nelson and the Mary Santos, fishing off of Cape Cod. And a squall came up and 19 men were lost. Singlebury's overturned. See, fishermen tell me them squalls would come right out of nowhere. You didn't even know they were coming, I guess, sometimes. That's the Arethusa, 1907. She was built in Jameson Tower in Essex. The big knockabout. Of course, here she's got a bowsprit on her. But she's built for Captain Clayton Morrissey, named after his daughter. Handsome vessel, a very fast sailor. And Captain Morrissey had a couple of run-ins with the Canadian cutters down there and outsailed them. And she got quite a name for herself in Newfoundland, outrunning the cutters. And here she's shown when she was sold in 1921 to Captain Bill McCoy from Florida. He was one of the first of the big run runners. Of course, Prohibition had come into effect at that time, and Captain Bill was, well, the real McCoy. He saw this vessel. He came to Gloucester and bought the Henry Marshall, little Portuguese vessel, and used her as a run runner, and she was seized. But while he was in Gloucester, while she was fitting out, he saw this vessel come in, and he fell in love with it. From that time on, he always loved this vessel. And he bought her. Finally bought her, had the chance to buy her. And he put a bowsprit in her, give her more head sail with an extra jib. See, she's carrying an extra jib. And put a deck house on her instead of the forecastle, because the warm weather he'd be traveling in, out of Nassau, the Hammer Islands. And this is 1922, sailing out of Gloucester Harbor. And he renamed her the Tomaka. And she was a thorn in the Coast Guard cutter's side for quite some time. And they finally nailed her, brought her in, sold her. And she finally landed back in Gloucester. And then she was fitted out and sold to Newfoundland. But the Newfoundlanders down there who bought her must have had great respect for her, because they renamed her Saucy Arethusa. I guess that's because of the runarounds they used to give the Canadian cutters. But she was lost going into Sambro with a cargo of fish, freighted cargo, later on. And they tell me that Bill McCoy searched for the wreck of this vessel. And he finally found pieces of her, I guess. And had little models made of them, I guess. But he was always loved this vessel. As the Queen of the Fleet in those days, the Oriole, 1908, built by James and Tower in Essex. And this vessel had quite a reputation. She was owned by Jordan, and her first skipper was Captain Thad Morgan. He was a giant man from Virginia, unusual for a Gloucester skipper. But he came from Virginia, but he was quite a fisherman. In fact, he was the one that lost the Fredonia when she was lost, back years before that. He's a good mackerel sailor, too. And this is her bound to the south, got her seine boats on deck. She's making a passage and tacking out of the harbor. And she's designed by McManus, but she was considered one of the fastest vessels in the fleet. In fact, they compared vessels at the time and later with the Oriole. And was she as fast as the Oriole, and so on and so on. And she finally was on a halibut trip with Captain Little Dan McDonald, and run down off of Seal Island, 1916, and 4 of her crew went down. She went down in about 4 or 5 minutes. The Norwegian freighter hit her, and the foremost fell over on the deck of the steamer, and that's how the crew managed to climb up the rigging and land on the deck, but 4 of them were below and couldn't make it, and they went down with the vessel. That's going down pretty fast. but she was almost cut in two. That's the Elsie, racing, 1910. Of course, we've all heard of her. She became a trial horse, you know, in the international races. The Elsie, when she was built, was just an ordinary fisherman. She was a fair sailor, and built for Atlantic Maritime Company in Boston. And but as it was, she happened to be around in 1921. After the Esperanto was lost, they had an elimination race. And Francie Pierce Company owned the vessel then. She'd been sold. And they had an elimination race to find the new defender of the Cup. And there was 5 vessels. And they raced off of the back shore, off of Thatcher's Island. And the Elsie, with Marty Welch, was captain of her. They picked him out. And as I say, she was a fair little sailor, good little sailor, and she won. So she was sent down, and meanwhile the Canadians had built the big Blue Nose, which would take her on deck, I guess, and built for racing. This vessel wasn't built for racing. And of course we know that she was beaten easily by the Blue Nose. And she was used in the early 1930s as a scout ship out here in Massachusetts Bay, training Sea Scouts. Captain William Nickerson was the skipper of her. And she was finally sold to the Keeley brothers in Newfoundland and lost off of St. Pierre. That's the Stiletto, 1910, built by John Bishop in Vincent Cove in Gloucester for Jordan Company. This picture I snapped, taken in the winter down in Jordan's Wharf. That building up above it used to be the gear shed. Jordan's later became, I think, American Phillip Company or something like that. That's one of the last buildings on the waterfront down in that section that remained. It wasn't torn down not too long ago. That's all Rose's Wharf down there now anyhow, that whole section. But that's the Stiletto, a handsome vessel. She was sister ship to my father Sylvania, and they both looked very much alike. And designed by McManus. And she was finally lost off of Fork River, New Jersey, on a mackerel seining trip with Captain Howard Toby in 1930. Now there's my father Sylvania. Now there's quite a vessel. Big vessel. She had a 76-foot main boom, a giant mainsail, and the mast heads are very big. 15-foot mast heads she had. That's very unusual at the time. And my father used to drive the devil out of this vessel, and because she could take it. And it was right to just what he wanted. And there was many a vessel that he'd come in contact with that he'd make them douse their mainsails. He wouldn't take his down, they took theirs. He had a lot of fishermen tell me a lot of bouts with the Aspinet, Captain Jake Brigham, Boston vessel. Old Jake there liked to carry sail, one of the best. And him and Sylvania had many a bout, but they always said that Jeff made old Jake douse his mainsail all the time. And that's why I say if my father had lived in his future Puritan after this vessel, when she was built to race, I think that with my father's reputation, with the Puritan's reputation, I think that that old cup would have stayed right in Gloucester. But it wasn't to be. But the Sylvania was then first had her mackerel seining when this picture was taken. In fact, Captain Firth gave me this picture. He told me a lot about the vessel. He told me an interesting thing in 1912. It seems so that year, that winter, the Heron fleet had done well. All the fleet, that was quite a trade in those days, and going to Newfoundland, pick up herring cargoes. And the whole fleet was down there, I guess. 25 vessels were at the Bay of Islands, 5 more 30 miles to the north at Bonny Bay. The Sylvania was at Bonny Bay with the Oriole, one of the 5, 2 of the 5. And they had 4 cargoes ready to come home. And that night a freeze came in and they got caught. Well, that people in Gloucester are frantic because, gee, that was a great part of the fleet. They had a chance of being frozen in all winter. Because when those freezes came in Newfoundland, I guess, they really came. And that meant that a great part of the fleet would be tied up the biggest part of the springs because the fleet wouldn't be, they couldn't get those vessels clear until April or May. And, one of the Newfoundland coastal steamers, the Portia, freed the vessels, broke up the ice at Bonny Bay just in time. Because the next day, I guess it really did come in solid. And meanwhile, the fleet got loose at the Bay of Islands, and they all headed for home. And I guess the Lottie Merchant was the leading, because Captain Firth told me that this vessel here, he never saw anything like it, and her dash down the Newfoundland coast, down across by Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, across the Bay of Fundy. She was like a racehorse. And he said that he nailed the big Massachusetts off of Shelburne, and the last one, which would be the first in line, the Lottie Merchant, off of Thatcher's. And the Sylvania beat the fleet. There's 30 vessels. And that came from Captain Firth's own lips, and I checked it out in the Times too. And this vessel could sail. Captain Firth told me that by the wind, the Oriole or the Massachusetts would beat her. But give her a little wind, hardly any vessel could touch her at that time. But the Sylvania was, my father made a lot of money in her, shacking, haddocking, and 1918, August 1918, when the big German raid on the fishing fleet, 5 big German U-boats, giant U-boats, came over and raided the American coast, and the U-156 captured a Canadian trawler, beam trawler, the Triumph, and put a prize crew under a lieutenant aboard. And the Triumph came up to the Sylvania and put a prize crew aboard of it, and sent time bombs aboard of her and blew the vessel apart. The lieutenant on the beam trawler came alongside of my father. My father saw her coming up, and he thought it was just a Canadian beam trawler flying the Canadian flags he wore, just come up to speak. And when she got up alongside, he run up the German flag, and the lieutenant in the megaphone wanted the captain. And he said, "Send the captain aboard." My father went aboard with a couple of his men, rode over with his papers and with American flags. He said, "I'm sorry, Captain." I shook hands with my father.
About 6 or 7 schooners from the end, I'll be darned, the tape shut off, and I had a fit. And we're going to attempt now to finish this tape some 30 years later, and I want to say to you, to the audience, How proud I am to do this. I wear my pride of my maritime heritage like a Burgee banner in a breeze. The Gloucester schooner Catherine. Everything about the Gloucester schooner Catherine was big. She was the biggest knockabout vessel out of Gloucester. She carried a big crew, spread a big sail area, was a big producer of big fish, halibut, and was commanded by a big man in heart, courage, character, and ability, Captain Archie McLeod, fisherman's nickname, Wild Archie. The Catherine was built by Arthur D. Story at Essex during the summer and fall of 1915. Her building cost was $16,500. She was modeled by Mr. Story off the schooner Bay State, a Thomas McManus design, but lengthened out in the bow and given more sheer. The Catherine was named after Captain Archie McLeod's wife and mother. She had the longest forecastle of any Gloucester fisherman at 53 feet. She carried 13 double dories and a crew of 29 men. The Catherine went halibutting in the summers and haddocking in the winters. She probably brought in more big halibut trips than any other vessel out of Gloucester. Catherine was a great sailor, especially in heavy weather. She could stand up with the best of them and was probably the fastest of all knockabout schooners. During her 18 years of fishing, Catherine took part in 3 dangerous rescues at sea, resulting in the saving of several lives. Catherine was very fortunate in the loss of crew members while fishing on the banks. No men were ever lost in dories, but 2 men lost their lives when swept overboard from the deck. The beautiful and mighty Catherine met her doom in 1933. Bound to Canso, Nova Scotia, she piled up on rocks at the entrance of the harbor and caught fire. Her crew were able to leave her in 9 dories. She burnt to the waterline, ending a career of one of the finest vessels that ever sailed out of Gloucester. This is a picture of the Gloucester schooner Gaspé, and she was one of a kind. She was a 3-masted schooner with her whaleback bow and round steamer-style stern with a railing. She was used as a freighter and brought in some of the biggest cargoes of salt fish into the port of Gloucester. She was a vessel with a most interesting career: fish freighter, movie vessel, rum runner, sailing under 3 names and 4 flags. Schooner Gaspé was built by Arthur D. Story in Essex during the spring and summer of 1917. Her owners were the Gorton Pugh Fisheries. The Gaspé presented a unique appearance to the Gloucester fleet, originally intended for a steam trawler. She was probably the only vessel of her type ever built, designed by Captain J.D.S. Nickerson, who was in charge of rigging for Gorton Pugh. She was named for the famous Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec, Canada. 2 100-horsepower crude oil engines were used for auxiliary power. She had a crew of 9 men. In her role as a fish freighter, she took saltfish cargoes picked up in Newfoundland and the Canadian provinces to many ports along the Atlantic coast. The Gaspé brought into Gloucester some very large trips of salt cod. Gloucester received quite a scare in November of 1918 when she arrived with one of her crew sick with smallpox. The rest of the crew were vaccinated, and the Gaspé was anchored on the Pancake Grounds out near the breakwater in quarantine for 1 week before she was released. In February of 1922, she was chartered by a silent film company to make a movie about whaling with the title of Down to the Sea in Ships, with some scenes shot in the Caribbean and New Bedford. In 1923, she was sold to parties in Palermo, Sicily, flying the Italian flag. A year later, she was back off the New England coast as a rum runner under the French flag and renamed Beatrice. In 1928, she was sold again to Belleromme, Newfoundland as a fish freighter and rum runner, renamed Chapel Point under the British flag. The end of the old Gaspé came in 1930 in December when she was destroyed by fire off Cape Colonet in Mexico. The Gloucester schooner Theodore Roosevelt was the first vessel to be built by Leonard B. Mackenzie at Pavilion Beach in Gloucester and was launched unnamed on August 31st, 1901. His shipyard was located on the southern end of the beach near the old Surfside Hotel. The schooner stuck in the sand after her launching, but was pulled out by the Gloucester tugs Startle and Priscilla. She was sold to the Fred L. Davis Fish Company and named Theodore Roosevelt after the president who started his term that same year. The Theodore Roosevelt was a fine, well-built, medium-sized vessel of 104 feet, weighing 125 tons, of the clipper bow type. She sailed on her maiden voyage to Newfoundland in command of Captain George H. Peoples and arrived back in Gloucester on December 6, 1901, with 1,450 barrels of salt herring. The voyage home had been a stormy one. When a heavy southeast gale sprang up, she was hit by a heavy sea on Cash's Bank and broke her main boom. On that same homeward-bound voyage, she was in the company of another Davis firm vessel, the schooner Eliza Parkhurst, Captain John D. McKinnon, fisherman's name, Short Scope. Both skippers had agreed to race home, and that wasn't unusual in the old days. The new Theodore Roosevelt gradually drew ahead and went off of Red Rock Island. The Parkhurst could just be made out far astern. That was the last ever seen of the Parkhurst and her crew. On October 31st, 1913, the Theodore Roosevelt, in command of Captain Bowie, ran aground at Trout Cove, Nova Scotia, with 100,000 pounds of salt cod on board, and she was given up as a total loss with no loss of life. However, she was refloated by the Nova Scotians and resold by the underwriters for $300 to a Mr. Boudelier of Digby, Nova Scotia, and renamed Lila Boudelier. In 1921, she was sold to parties in Newfoundland, and on December 3rd, 1921, was lost with all hands in the Atlantic, finally rejoining the Eliza Parkhurst, who she had left behind in her wake 20 years past. This is the picture of the beautiful schooner Mayflower. Many of the Essex and Gloucester-built fishing schooners of the early to mid-1900s were famous for one or more particular characteristics concerning their names, size, width, length, speed, big trips of fish, long voyages, the tallest masts, and loss of life and vessel. The big Essex-built and Boston-based schooner Mayflower sadly will be remembered for the turmoil and man-made fiasco that she was involved in as one of the possible entrants in the international fishermen's races between Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, and Gloucester, Mass. Of 1921. Mayflower proved to be a fast vessel, designed by W. Starling Burgess, the famed vessel designer who drew the lines for Columbia and Puritan. But she was denied the chance to race against Canada and will be remembered for the insane and mistrustful behavior of the Lunenburg and Gloucester race committees, who argued and schemed to disqualify Mayflower from competing in the races. Captain Angus Walters, the skipper of the newly launched Lunenburg saltbanker Bluenose, and the lord and master of his vessel, believed that Mayflower just might beat his vessel in a race. The Lunenburg Race Committee came up with all sorts of lame reasons to disbar Mayflower from the races. The Gloucester Race Committee came up with their own negative and self-serving reasons to disqualify Mayflower from participating in the elimination races. The fact that she was a Boston home-ported vessel and the possibility that if the Mayflower did indeed beat Bluenose, the city of Boston would have reaped all the glory and publicity that the city of Gloucester wanted and needed so badly. Soon after the multiple race committees fiascos, the schooner Mayflower owners changed her sailpan, shortened her masts by 9 feet, and installed a 100-horsepower engine in her that would turn her into an auxiliary fishing vessel. Mayflower would never again be involved in any future international fishermen's races. Ironically, the provincial flower of Nova Scotia is the Mayflower, symbolizing and suggesting achievement in the face of adversity. The Mayflower is also the state flower of Massachusetts. This is a picture of the legendary schooner, Gloucester schooner Puritan. The Puritan was a big, handsome schooner with a spoon bow, short bowsprit, and a very lofty sail rig. She carried 11 double dories and a crew of 25 men. She was named after the America's Cup defender of 1885. When the schooner Elsie was defeated by the Canadian schooner Bluenose at Halifax, Nova Scotia in October of 1921, a group of Cape Ann people got together and formed the Manta Associates. They vowed to bring the International Fisherman's Cup back to Gloucester. Again, W. Starling Burgess, the great yacht designer, was commissioned to draw the lines of this new vessel, and she was designed for speed, with the tallest mainmast in any Gloucester vessel at 89 feet above the deck. Mr. Burgess was a genius at getting the utmost speed out of a vessel without sacrificing her utility. The Puritan was launched before a huge crowd on March 15, 1922, at the J.F. James Shipyard in Essex. Her new skipper was Captain Jeff Thomas, my grandfather, one of the greatest sail carriers out of Gloucester. He was schooled by the legendary skipper, Captain Marty Welch, and what these two men did not know about sailing a vessel was not worth talking about. Captain Jeff could drive a vessel for all she was worth, but he never lost a man while making a fast passage to market. It was hard to get a sight, meaning a job, with Captain Jeff, as he carried the same crew for many, many years. He never spoke a harsh word to his men, was known to be stoic, modest, and he was a hard worker. The Puritan proved to be a ghost on the water, tricky and hard to handle. The Puritan sailed on her maiden voyage halibutting on April 17, 1922. She was towed out from Harbor Cove in Gloucester Harbor by the ex-Navy subchaser SC-247 to 10 Pound Island, where she dropped her tow line. Off the breakwater, the subchaser, doing 11 knots, tried to overhaul her, but could not do so and was left far behind in her wake. Puritan sailed to Booth Bay, Maine on her third fishing trip for bait and ice. From Thatcher's Light in Booth Bay, she made the trip in just 5 hours and 7 minutes with a log speed of 14 1/2 knots. She fairly flew over the water. Sadly, the next news of Puritan was a dispatch from the Halifax Herald newspaper on June 24, 1922, that the Puritan had sailed over the Northwest Bar on Sable Island, the graveyard of the Atlantic, in the fog with the loss of 1 crewman, and was a total loss. 15 of her crew had gotten off in dories and headed for the Nova Scotian coast, but Captain Thomas and 7 of his crew landed on the island and were later rescued by the American Coast Guard cutter Tampa. The International Fisherman's Cup would forever remain in Canada. The schooner Columbia was one of Gloucester's most famous and infamous fishing vessels in many ways. She was one of the American contenders in the International Fishermen's Races of 1923 between Gloucester and Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, racing against the Bluenose. She was the last vessel to sail salt fishing from the port of Gloucester, bringing in some big trips of salt fish, but unfortunately took more men to a watery grave at one time than any other Gloucester vessel. Columbia was built at the A.D. Story shipyard in Essex, Mass. In 1923 to replace the fast Puritan that was lost off the northwest bar of Sable Island in June of 1922. She was designed by W. Starling Burgess of Boston, one of the greatest designers of sailing vessels in the 20th century. Columbia had a successful 5-year fishing career, bringing in some big trips of salted codfish. On October 30th, 1924, she arrived back in Gloucester with her second trip of 385,000 pounds of salt fish for a fine stock of $18,573 and a share for each man of $360. Now, this high amount of money was referred to by the dorymen, the fishermen, as ringing the bell. On October 20th, 1927, the headlines in the Gloucester Daily Times carried the tragic announcement: no hope now for the schooner Columbia, lost with all hands during the fierce gale of August 24th, 1927, off of Sable Island, the dreaded graveyard of the Atlantic, with a loss of 22 brave crewmen. That terrible gale of August 24th, 1927, was one of the worst storms in the history of the North Atlantic fishery. In addition to the loss of 22 men from the Columbia, 4 Lunenburg salt bankers were lost with all hands, and that was a combined loss of 107 fishermen from both countries. At 2 a.m. on New Year's Day in 1928, the Nova Scotian beam trawler Venesta, while dragging some 40 miles off the northwest coast of Sable Island, got her trawl gear caught up and entangled in bottom wreckage. With powerful engines and winches pulling the taut steel cables, a phantom vessel slowly emerged from the dark sea with 2 masts and no topmasts. Floodlights, strong floodlights, revealed an eerie sight: a derelict vessel in fairly good condition. The main portion of her rigging was still intact, indicating that she hadn't been in the water for a long time. Although no name could be seen, several crew members from the Venesta believed that this looked like a Gloucesterman and not a Lunenburger, and might be the Columbia. Suddenly, the cable snapped, and the mystery vessel slowly settled back into the cold depths of the Atlantic. God rest all of their fishermen's souls. A very sad picture indeed of the schooner Mary E. O'Hara. The ill-fated 92-foot Mary O'Hara was launched on March 11, 1922, at the A.D. Story shipyard in Essex. She was named after the sister of the O'Hara brothers, who operated out of the Boston Fish Pier. When the vessel sank, Mary O'Hara told her brothers, "Never name anything after me again." Brothers Leo and Frank Hines both served as captains on the Mary E. O'Hara during her fishing career. Her last captain was Fred Wilson, who had swapped his Shamrock for the Mary E. O'Hara as he was getting older, and the Mary O'Hara was a smaller vessel carrying 23 crewmen opposed to his old Shamrock, who carried 33. On January 21st, 1941, the Mary E. O'Hara met a tragic end at the mouth of Boston Harbor. 3 miles from Winthrop. During a snowstorm, with little visibility, she collided with the coal-laden barge Winfred Sheridan, which was being towed out. Crew members that had succeeded in escaping their bunks attempted to launch their dories, but the dories were frozen to the deck. They climbed the rigging, hoping for rescue. During the next several cold hours, crew members tried to keep their hold on the icy rigging and watched as their mates fell to their icy graves. When rescuers from Boston finally arrived, they found only 4 feet of the Mary E. O'Hara's mainmast showing above the water. 5 crew members were saved, the other 18 lost. The Gloucester and Boston schooner adventure. The late historian and prolific Gloucester writer Joe Garland called the National Historic Landmark schooner adventure the old Ironsides of the North Atlantic fisheries. Adventure is the last of the Gloucester and Boston dory fishing schooners and the biggest producer and moneymaker of any vessel during the years she fished, with a total earnings of $4.5 million in 38 years. Her first master was Captain Jeff Thomas, a native of Aarschot, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, who had her built in 1926 and whose life came to an end in her pilot house while at sea in March of 1934. Her second skipper, Captain Leo Hines, whose fisherman's nickname was In and Out Hines because he made so many fishing trips out of Boston Harbor and back in again, was a capable Newfoundlander who fished her until 1953, when Adventure's fishing career came to an end. Though sea-worn and battered, she was still seaworthy, but her crew of old men had worn out. A partnership bought Adventure in 1954, removed the engine and the bulkheads, built staterooms in the fish hold and engine room, and sailed her out of Rockland, Maine, in the Windjammer schooner trade under Captain Dayton Newton. In 1965, at the age of 31, Captain Jim Sharp bought her and sailed her as a windjammer out of Camden, Maine, cruising the coast of Maine for 24 years, much to the delight of hundreds of paying passengers. In 1988, Captain Sharp sailed her back to her home port of Gloucester and gave her as a gift to the citizens of Gloucester to be restored and sailed as a monument to the fishing industry. Restoration of historic vessels requires thousands of hours of hard work and a vast amount of money gained through federal, public, and private grants, as well as a volunteer force through the years that can truly be called the finest kind. My late father, Gordon Thomas, was extremely proud of Adventure. She was his favorite, having named her when he was 15 years old for his father, Captain Jeff. His 12-year-old sister, Natalie, christened her in 1926. Gordon was her first biographer. Schooner Adventure belongs to the citizens of Gloucester, who are indeed fortunate to have her back in the mother port of the fishermen as a piece of her historic maritime legacy. This is a picture of the famous Gloucester schooner Gertrude L. Thibault. The Gertrude L. Thibault was the last of a long line of able fishing schooners that brought fame, prosperity, and glory to the city of Gloucester. She was the last of her type built in Essex for the Gloucester fisheries. The Thibault, as she was always known, was one of the most publicized and photographed Gloucester vessels. She sailed many miles as a fisherman showboat, Arctic explorer, international fishermen's races contender, and in World War II, she was chartered by the U.S. Coast Guard as the flagship of their famous Corsair fleet, looking for German subs along the coast of New England. Through the generosity of Mr. Louis Thibault, a French-American summer resident of Gloucester, this fine vessel, named for his wife, was built during the winter of 1929-1930 at the A.D. Story Shipyard in Essex. Mr. Thibault contributed $30,000 to her building, his wife $5,000. She had the honor, the Thibault, of being the last Gloucesterman built with tall spars, topmasts, and a bowsprit. During her fishing career, she was commanded by several well-known Gloucester skippers, among them Captains Freeman Kroll, Jimmy Abbott, Archie McLeod, Wild Archie, Mike Clark, Cecil Moulton, and John Matheson, and of course, Ben Pine. On July 27, 1933, the Thibault sailed from Gloucester in command of Captain Pine as Massachusetts exhibition to the World's Fair in Chicago by way of the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. The Thibault proved to be quite an attraction at the fair, averaging 2,500 visitors a day. Also at the fair was the schooner Bluenose, Canada's pride and joy, which is depicted on their dime. The unbeaten Bluenose of the International Fishermen's Races fame actually was beaten twice by Gloucester vessels, but in the Lipton Cup races. The final race for the International Fishermen's Cup was in October of 1938 off Gloucester. The Bluenose, with Captain Angus Walters of Lunenburg, beat the Thibault in 3 out of 5 races, and so the cup remained in Canada, as it does today. In August of 1944, the Thibault was sold to Mr. William Hoffer of New York City to be used as a freighter in the Caribbean and South American waters. She sailed from the Gloucester for the last time on May 29, 1945. As her tall spars disappeared over the horizon, a grand and glorious era of great schooners and Gloucestermen came to an end. The Thibault was smashed to pieces on the breakwater at La Guaira, Venezuela, with no loss of life in February of 1948. Ironically, her Canadian rival, the Bluenose, met her doom off the coast of Haiti 2 years earlier. This means a lot to me, to be able to finish that tape, that lecture, that wasn't finished some 30 years ago. Down at Gloucester Harbor, in front of our famous man-at-the-wheel statue, there are 10 granite blocks with a total of 665 names of Gloucester fishermen lost at sea in single and double dories. And that's called a cenotaph. It's from the Greek. It means a tomb or a monument erected to a person or persons whose remains lie at sea, bodies not recovered. This is the way my late father, Gordon W. Thomas, Mr. Schooner, signed, autographed all his books, Fast and Able and Wharf and Fleet. Fair winds and smooth seas. Thank you.